You're listening to the What's Happening podcast with Gary White.
I'm here today with Bill Windauer. Bill is an ex-Hawkeye football player. And what were the years, Bill? When did you play football at Iowa?
68 to 72.
68 to the good years, right? I won't go through the record.
No, please don't. Please don't.
Then from that, you went on and played for the Baltimore Colts, right? From what years?
And a couple other teams, as a matter of fact. Yeah, so I was drafted by the Baltimore Colts. Never even imagined I was going to be playing pro football, but I got drafted. Went to Baltimore, played there 2 years. Third year, I was cut and came back to Iowa City, and then got picked up for a short time with the Dolphins. Then the Giants signed me, and I played with the Giants. And actually, one of my teammates there was Larry Zonka.
Really?
So he had come from the
Miami.
World Football. He went to the World Football League. Then it was their fullback. So I was sort of a body double for Larry Zonka for a while without a real broken nose.
I remember the Dolphins, 72, they won all their games and won the Super Bowl.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, that was right about that time, but I didn't stay there, unfortunately. I was with the Giants. Then went to the Falcons for a year, and then I ended up at the Dolphins. And I was there for a year, got banged up some, had some surgery, and after 5, going into 6 years, I retired.
So you retired, what, around 80, 78, 80?
What? 78.
78, okay,
yes.
Great. And then you came back to Iowa and you worked at the foundation for what, 30, 40 years?
I worked at Alumni Association for just a couple, and then I moved over to the foundation, and I was a fundraiser there for 35 years.
Wow.
Half the time with the College of Business, and we built the Tippy College of Business building, and then half the time with the College of Dentistry.
Great.
And then we built or renovated the dental building. So that was sort of my job.
So you got some roots here at University of Iowa, right?
A lot of roots. Met my wife here. We stayed here, raised our kids here.
Great. Well, so today, once in a while when I see it at the leadership meeting that we have, we're always talking about veterans and World War II, World War I. And I know you've kind of been a world traveler and went to some of these battle sites. So I thought it'd be a great podcast just for you and I just to talk about what you've seen,
yes,
what you went through or by looking at these different battle sites. So let's start today. We're going to go from the Battle of Verdun in France, and then we're going to end up at World War I, and then we're going to end up in World War II at the Battle of the Bulge.
Yes.
Which was made famous by Patton and the show. Patton, I think, came out in
Band of
1970.
Brothers.
Yep, Band of Brothers, 101st Airborne or whatnot. So anyway, let's start with Verdun. So I know we got some pictures, you got some slides. I know you spent some time, you had a guide. So I'll let you run with it if you want to tell the listeners about Verdun.
Sure. So as you're looking at the map, what happened during World War I, and I'm not an expert or a historian, but I read a lot. In the Battle of Verdun, the Germans wanted to take over France and take over Europe. It was sort of like what happened in World War II also. But as they came across and came into France, they met with pretty strong resistance from the French. And what they thought would be a real fast track across the country of France turned out to be really a stagnant line. And so what you see at the top of this map, the purple markings, is really the battle line in Verdun. Germans on the top, French on the bottom. The town of Verdun, or the city of Verdun, was actually the headquarters for the French army in that area. And so that's where all the supplies and everything came from. Now, if you watch some of the movies or anything about this, you'll see that it was trench warfare. So the Germans dug in on one side, the French dug in on the other side, and then all of a sudden they just started bombarding each other. And so they had these siege guns.
How far apart were they when they were trench warfare? Were they half a mile, quarter of a mile?
In the trench warfare, they were on top of each other.
Right on top
150 yards. So one night the French may attack over a pockmarked battlefield with barbed wire and everything. and they'd go and run over the trenches of the Germans. Next night, the Germans would do the same thing. It was sort of following the old kind of warfare where they just have lines of men go across, get shot down, and then retreat, back and forth,
I've heard that the sergeants or whatnot in the trenches had whistles, that if you didn't get up and go into the fire, they'd shoot you.
Well, they would keep usually one person behind in the trench, and they would say, if someone comes back over the trench, shoot them. Yeah. And so it was on the battlefield too, as you'll see. You can go to the next picture.
There you go.
These are the two guys that I travel with, Dave Triplett and on the right and Dave Dirks on the left. They both worked with me at the foundation. Dave Triplett on the right was a teammate of mine at Iowa. They're standing with one of the siege shells that they were lobbing across. And what changed the warfare also at that time is they went from gunpowder as explosives to nitroglycerin and TNT. So a shell like this with gunpowder in it would destroy stuff in a very close proximity, throwing shrapnel out. When you put nitroglycerin, TNT into a shell like that, it caused massive devastation, not only in craters, but throwing the shrapnel at such high speeds that it would just cut down everything around it. And so this is probably maybe a medium size of a shell that they were lobbing back and forth. Wow. The Germans would set up these massive guns, and that's why this war didn't move very far one way or the other, because these massive guns couldn't move across the countryside. They would put them in and start shooting them. So anyway, that's sort of an example of the shell. You can go to the next slide, please.
It's a huge shell.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't imagine the size of their howitzers or whatever they called the cannons.
Now, there was a museum in this tower. That's where that shell was. This is called the Ossuary, and this is in the middle of the battlefield. Now, this is a memorial to the dead in French, and there weren't really any allies fighting in these areas. It was always the French against the Germans. And so on the top floor, across the whole site, it's 100 yards long at least. There's just a bunch of memorials. But then what they say is there are observation windows along the foundation. You go outside and look through these windows. So on the cemetery, which you'll see in the next slide coming up, there's the graves of 15,000 French soldiers. It's like one of our cemeteries at Normandy or anywhere.
Is this in Verdun, this museum?
This is right outside of Verdun on the battlefield. Underneath, a priest from Verdun went onto the battlefield a year or so after with the people of the town to sort of clean up the battlefield because everything got destroyed. They picked up the bones of 150,000 men, skeletons, bones, and put them in the basement of this building. So you can look in and see the bones. And these are maybe Germans, maybe French, they don't know because they were just on the battlefield. That's the ones they could find. Buried in that battlefield, they still find skeletons, they find ordnance, they find everything.
Was this the first major battle of World War I?
It's one of the closer ones to the German border. The sequence, they had a whole battle line going all the way across down south of France, all the way across over to pretty much Antwerp, and they called it the Battle of the Somme, Somme, I believe. And so there were battlefields like this all across France. This was one of the main ones, though. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is the cemetery view from the top of the ossuary. So you can see across the countryside what it looks like, though at the time of the battle there were no trees, there was nothing except craters like on the moon. And as you can see, and this is one side of the cemetery. If you'd swing the camera to the other side, there'd be identical. It looks very similar to what an American cemetery looks like on foreign soil.
And this is French.
These are the French. Yes.
Okay.
You can go to the next slide, please. Now, this is going through the woods, partially through the battlefield. This is interesting because this was actually a town. So all you see now are craters and humps, and you'll see debris of stone and tile from the roofs and everything. And you'll walk all the way through these woods, and and they've marked where the homes are. So they'll have a marker saying, this is the tailor's home. This is the person who has the store's home, but there's no home. There's just a hole in the ground.
What town was it? Was this Verdun?
It's right.
Verdun?
No, it's these little towns, and on that map it tells the little towns, but it's like a little French village, and they're spotted all across this whole territory, and they just completely wiped that out. You go to the next slide, please. Now, this is the fort, one of the forts. This is Fort Dumont, which is on that battlefield. Now, when that fort started, it had walls and roofs and everything. It's all a tunnel complex. At that time, wars were fought with fortresses, and they had tunnels underneath. As you can see, the shells just bombarded these things and turned them into, on the surface, looks like rubble. But you can go inside and actually walk through this fort because it's buried so deeply in the ground. And the kind of guns they had, which is very interesting, if you walk up on top, they actually had a pit with a metal top on it. And if you go inside, the gun is actually, they can retrieve it into the ground. And when they want to fire it, it comes out of the ground, shoots a shell, and then it goes back down into the ground. So, I mean, they weren't just a cannon sitting there on the surface. They would go up and down, load it, go up, shoot.
So tell me how the French, why they have these emplacements. They took a while to build them. So did they have like the Siegfried line? You know, did they have a line pre-made to stop the Germans from coming in?
Well,
like a
wall?
wall?
That was called the Maginot Line at that time. And that really came almost after World War I, to get ready for the Germans again.
Okay.
So these were sort of the remnants of old forts that had been there before because they fought wars in these areas for centuries. And if you go into Verdun, they call it the Concierge, which is a massive fort that's in the middle of that city, and it's all tunnels. On the surface, it looks like a fort with the complexes, with the walls and everything, and the ramparts, but underneath it's a rabbit warren of tunnels. And that's what this is a rabbit warren of tunnels underneath. And they had these forts all across the country, and the Germans would come and try to wipe them out, and they would protect themselves by shooting back.
Is that a block interior? Did you go inside the?
Oh yeah,
tunnels?
I think I have a picture. The next picture, I think, yeah.
Oh, there.
So this is what the tunnel. I mean, they're very well built. I mean, these things. It goes all the way through the ground. Some places it's wet and musty and dirty. Some, if you get to the center, the core, they're cleaner. They had their kitchens in there. They had, for medical reasons, their bunk beds, the whole bit. So it was a functioning fort. Next slide, please.
You ever been in the beer caves in Iowa City?
Under
the brewery? That's what that looks like.
It's sort of like that. So after and there's some beautiful museums also that you can go to in Verdun and in the surrounding area that really show in very much detail what the battles were like and everything. As a matter of fact, they just did redid a movie. It's All Quiet in the Western Front. It's on Netflix. And if it's from the German standpoint, but you go to it and it's so severe in seeing what the battle's like. It's worth watching because it'll take you right into the trenches in that movie. So it's very good. So after we left, we went across the country, we were seeing different World War I sites. So a lot of people hear of Sergeant York. You know, he was a guy that, you know, a country kid that came from the United States, got sent over. The Americans came over later in the war, about
18?
Yeah,
19?
Yeah, 19, 18, right around that time.
Right.
And this area here, it's sort of his circuit. What happened with him is they were part of a platoon going through the woods, the forest. It's like walking through at Lake McBride here in Iowa City, walking through, and they came across some German machine gun pits. They fought with the Germans. He picked off a few Germans, and he went into the trenches, because here again they were digging trenches, and he actually captured, I believe, 40 guys, something like that, as he went through the trenches, and they came out. So we walked the circuit of Sergeant York just to see what it was like. And this is when, as the Americans came in, also the first Marines came into battle here in France in the Battle of Belle Wood. Okay, you can go to the next slide.
I think Sergeant York was from West Virginia, and I guess he was a good turkey hunter. And so he just equated, shooting Germans as shooting turkeys, I guess.
Well,
Something like that.
A lot of the American soldiers were just country guys,
Right,
and
right.
they had grown up with guns. They had hunted and everything, so they were very good at being soldiers in the trenches, in the foxholes.
He was a Medal of Honor winner, wasn't he, York?
Yes. Now, one thing when we were reading up on the history of this area, we heard of the Marines being called the Devil Dogs, and the Germans said the Americans fought so ferociously that they called them the Devil Dogs. Well, there's an estate in this little town of Bella, and we went there looking for what we heard was the Devil Dog Fountain. And this is what the Germans used in naming the Americans, because of this fountain. And we looked and looked. We went into this town, and it was just this in the middle of the country. And as we were scoping around behind this big sycamore tree, what do we find? But we found the fountain in the courtyard of this old abandoned estate. And this is the sacred fountain of the Marine Corps. And they commemorate different times, their anniversaries and everything, or Marines come here and drink out of this fountain at whenever they feel it's important to them. And so anyway, we came and we actually got water from this fountain and shared it with some friends who were Marines, and we actually drank out of this fountain. It was really an interesting thing to come across.
Is this a public area, or is it a private house? Or?
No, it's sort of a private estate. As a matter of fact,
Really?
There's a small museum across the street, and we pulled in there and we saw the sign, and on our GPS it was showing it was right here, and we didn't know. And there was this metal gate, and this closed to this courtyard of this estate, but there's nobody there. It was we got there early in the morning, and all of a sudden I see this fountain behind a tree in the courtyard, and I just flicked the latch of this gate, and the gate's opened. So we walked in. We found out later the museum will take you over there and show you around, but they were even closed. It didn't open till 10, and we were there at about 8:30, 9 o'clock. So we sort of just wandered in and found this, and luckily nobody came and kicked us out.
Yeah. I figured it'd be more public than that.
No, it's so small. I mean, you go across the French countryside, and it's pretty small. We can go to the next slide. We could talk a whole day on just World War I. So this is the American cemetery in Belle Wood. And here again, they're just beautiful cemeteries. They have American guards at each of these cemeteries watching over things. They clean them up. They're just beautiful. So we went to many of these cemeteries, and they're so moving, and you tend to walk through the cemetery and see the soldiers and where they came from and everything. And so I turned right, and I walked into the cemetery to just sort of look at the gravestones. You can go to the next picture, please. And what I find, the first cross that I come across is a guy from Iowa, Glenn Morrow. And I'm not sure what age this man was. He died in 1918 in the Battle of Bella Wood, and probably an 18-year-old kid. And it was so moving to me that just sprang out to me, and here's an Iowa kid all the way in France, killed on the battlefield. And that's what it's like when you walk through these cemeteries. You just see person after person after person. Next slide, please. I can start here. Okay. So we'll get into this in just a second. This is starting the Battle of the Bulge. And so like I said, as we traveled across, we tried to see as much as we could. It wasn't an organized tour for the World War I things, but we wanted to get a feel, because most people of our age and younger, not too many even older, they remember World War II, but they don't remember World War I. That was our grandparents' and great-grandparents' time, and it gets lost in the shuffle. I had a great uncle. As a matter of fact, I had two great uncles, and I believe one fought for the Germans in World War I on the Bavarian front. But my other uncle fought in this area. I'm not sure where, but he came back and his lungs were burned out from mustard gas. And so he always had this real bad cough. His whole life that I knew him as a little kid, he had this cough, and he had been damaged from World War I.
Tell us about mustard gas. What is it?
Well, they had all kinds of terrible gases, and it's just a caustic material that any of the gases that they spread on the battlefield, they're heavier than air. So because it was trench warfare, they'd release these gases. They called it mustard gas, and I'm not sure what the makeup of it is, but it was a very caustic gas. And as it would spread over the battlefield, it would sink into the trenches. Well, that's where the men were hiding, and they would just suffocate to death. So if they gave the signal, they'd put their gas masks on, and then they would be hopefully protected from the gas, but it would burn their eyes, it would burn anything, their skin. And they had so many different kinds of very nasty weapons. They had massive flamethrowers. The French brought in tanks. They finally started using tanks on the battlefield at this time, where before that it was mostly horses and infantry on foot. And now they started to mechanize. World War I started to mechanize. What we'll see in advancements in the Battle of the Bulge or World War II.
So think about, let's talk about trench warfare. Somewhere, I don't know if it was at the Hoover Library, I went in and they had an exhibit. So you have all these sandbags, or you have these trenches. Mm-hmm. So you got all these guys in these trenches, and maybe 150, 200 yards is the enemy.
Yes.
So in between no man's land, I think they called it that, is razor wire. There's probably mines. There's everything.
Anything, machine gun pits, everything.
So everybody's dug in each side. Then you're throwing mustard gas up. You're shelling them. And then they blow a whistle, and you crawl up out of that. And you got machine gun nests that just mow you down. And you either go or you stay in the trench, you get shot, so there's no options. Mm-hmm. And a lot of guys, as soon as they pop their heads up, were shot coming out of those. And then you run across no man's land and either get killed or wounded or caught in a wire.
Or jump into another hole.
Or jump into another hole with somebody else and just stay in there for quite a while.
Yeah.
And then it goes back and forth. The Germans would come one night, the French. Mind-boggling. There was a show that I saw, I don't know when it was, 4 or 5 years ago, and it was more of a British young man that had a horse. It was called War Horse.
Just saw it.
Did you see it? And it was depicting how horses pulled these cannon. Mm-hmm. and you know, they just were really cruel to the horses, too, because they didn't have mechanized at that point where they could pull the cannons around the mud and whatnot. And this horse went through everything. He was kind of like in trench warfare himself.
It's a true story.
Yeah.
Also.
And then he ended up coming back. I won't give the punchline here, but it's a heck of a story about World War I and how awful it was and how many people were wounded or killed in trench warfare, and there was just no way out of it. You just keep going back and forth and back and forth.
Yeah.
So
I think there's a resurgence of people looking into World War I now. I've been seeing more movies about it,
Yeah.
and it's just an interesting time in the history. And so we were talking about the Maginot Line, then the forts and everything. So what the French did then is, after World War I, they decided they didn't want to mess with the Germans anymore. So they built what they called was the Maginot Line, which was a series of these bunkers and forts and guns all pointing toward Germany. And they said, if we build an impenetrable wall, the Germans aren't going to come and bother us anymore. Well, so here comes Hitler. Now Hitler decides he's going to do it again, and he's going to attack France. But warfare has changed. It's become mechanized. Tanks, fast vehicles. So what the Germans did, which they called the Blitzkrieg, it's lightning war. What they did is they amassed at their border, charged across France, bypassed all of these forts, took France over in a very quick period of
I think
time.
it was 6 days.
Yes, because the guns were only pointing one way, and the Germans were already past the guns. The Germans took over France very quickly. So by doing that, they had a lot of confidence in their battle tactics, which rightly so they did. They had a very strong Air Force. They had a pretty strong Navy. They had their tank battalions. They had their infantry. The numbers of soldiers and in Germany during World War II, I was pulling up some stuff. 18 million men in German army at that time. And that was the armed forces, the Army, Luftwaffe, Navy, and everything. And that's not a very big country, and they have 18 million men. The Americans, at the same time, had 2 million men fighting in Europe, but there was also the French and the British and others. And so as we went to Normandy, finally, and we came back across, we pushed the Germans back, I say fairly quickly, but we pushed them back a lot faster than the Germans could have ever imagined. The main reason because of that is we had unlimited amounts of materials. We had assembly lines. We had nothing in the United States that was damaging our infrastructure. We had petroleum. Germans, on the other hand, were sort of on their German country island. They didn't have a lot of the same infrastructure, and they were fighting on two fronts. They were fighting the Russians on one side and the Allies, the French, not the French, the British and the Americans on the other side. And so they were hemmed in on both sides. So what Germany did during the time they held France, they built what they called the Siegfried Line. And I'll show you a picture in a little bit, but of what that looked like.
Let's go into World War I, just getting into two.
Yeah.
And Hitler was in the German army.
Hitler was in German army.
And I think he always wanted to go back and take France or take Europe because he was in and defeated. And then you said Harry Truman.
Turns out Harry Truman, I found out, I went to his museum down in Key West, and he was also in World War I.
I didn't know
and
that.
he faked, he memorized the eye chart so he could get in, but he wore glasses. And I'm not sure where Harry Truman fought, but it had to be in France because the Americans were mostly in France at that time.
He was a great president. I always remember on his desk he had "The buck stops here."
Yeah.
Which is a great slogan, by the way. I think
Later
it's
on,
great.
I'll show you his desk with that slogan. I have a picture
love
of it. So
He was pretty. He was a Midwestern guy, and he understood where he's coming from.
Yeah,
He didn't mince words, but
if we've covered this much in World War I, we got a lot in the Battle of the Bulge here.
So you want to get into the Battle of the Bulge? You were there. You two were there.
We flew into Brussels and then went across into the center part in Luxembourg to Cherbourg, which was one of the towns that was very close to the front lines. And what happened is, as the Americans pushed across and they got close to the Rhine, as a matter of fact, you can see the Rhine that runs right along here. The Germans still held a lot of this territory across from the Rhine. This is somewhat the border. And so at that time, there was about 80,000 Americans. Pretty much the Americans were the whole front line there, and they were spread very thinly. They were mostly resting because the Germans were on the defensive and they were moving back very fast. So the Americans had a rest in this whole region. Well, during the same time, Hitler is saying we're getting clobbered on the Eastern Front with the Russians, and the Americans are pushing on the Western Front. And in his mind, he didn't tell anybody this at first. He thought of it himself. He said, if we can push through this weakening American forces, because they did not have any supply lines close to the front. They had to bring materials all the way from Normandy. Antwerp and the bays up on the edge of Belgium, those were mined by the Germans. The Germans were on the one side, and the Americans and English were on the other side. And so they were trying to open these bays to bring supplies in there, but they couldn't yet. And Hitler, it was a short distance through tough territory, and he said, I'm going to do another blitzkrieg through this area and get to Antwerp, split the British and the Americans. If we split the British and the Americans, they will be weakened, and then they'll sign an armistice with us, and then we can get back to fighting the Russians. That's what he believed. He told his key people, he was very mistrustful at that time because one of his generals or colonels tried to blow him up, tried to kill him. And the German soldier or the old army didn't like Hitler. They felt he was destroying Germany and destroying the people. And so they wanted to sort of to assassinate him. And so he did not share except for his real close confidants. So his idea was to start building up the panzer units along the front and bringing panzers from the Eastern Front across, conscripting more people, including young boys and old men, into the infantry, and build a battle line. So before December 16th, it took a number of weeks. He slowly brought troops and materials all the way to that front right across from the American lines, and he did it in secret. He only brought things at night by trains, so our Air Force couldn't wipe out his equipment coming, and tanks, and he used horses and covered the roads with straw so they didn't hear him at night as they were going across. The horses actually had straw shoes on their feet so they didn't hear the horses pulling supplies. They brought all these supplies built up across this front, artillery, tanks, infantry, built up to 250,000 men. And he decided then on the 16th to charge across, catch the Americans by surprise, make a run to Antwerp. That's why they call it the bulge, because as you see, there was a bulge in the front line, and he felt his tanks could move very fast and across and destroy everything. And this wasn't just the regular tank units. It was the SS. So a little bit of background there. Hitler's SS, and it was the Schutzstaffel, which was the SS. And they had different levels of the SS, and they were the nastiest fighters. Leading that group was their security police or Gestapo. Those are the ones that you see in the leather coats and going in and capturing people and killing them and, getting information. They had the SS death squads. They were the prison camp guys. They were killing, any undesirables, including the Holocaust and the Jews. They were, as you can tell again, the nastiest of nasty people. And then they had the SS Waffen, which was the fighting corps of the SS, and a lot of the panzer units had SS leadership, and even their infantry guys, and they wore the death skull on their uniforms, and as they went across, they didn't take prisoners; they killed across. It was just taking over and killing as they went across. And there was a lot of atrocities throughout Luxembourg and Belgium as they went across, as maybe we'll talk a little bit about. So anyway, they sprang into action really quickly. Okay, so this sort of gives you an idea of the different units of the panzers as they were lined up across this whole battlefront. The territory, too, is not just rolling hills and fields. Tanks, for a tank to go across that, it's easy. In the wintertime, if the ground's corrosion, this was like going across from Illinois to Iowa on the Mississippi and then hitting all of those massive ravines. The countryside in that area, there were a number of rivers going through, and there were these steep ravines. So all the roads were switchback roads across, and some of them went from minor pavement to gravel to dirt. Hitler's tanks were big. They started, and I looked up some of the tanks that they were using, and we're going to see one in a bit. But he had the regular Panther tanks. They were 44-ton tanks, okay, and that was their small tanks. And their armament was, they could travel at 45 miles an hour for 160 miles. So it was like it was a car. Then they had the Tiger tanks, which was a bigger tank. Armament was much thicker on those, and they were 54 tons, and they could travel 45 miles an hour. Then they had the Royal Tiger, which was even a bigger tank, 68 tons. They could travel 40 miles an hour. And so you can just imagine these guys coming across at those speeds across the fields at you, firing their 88 millimeter howitzers, destroying everything. And then I didn't even know they had such a tank as this, but they called it the Strum Tiger, which was a tank built on a Tiger body, but it had a 380 millimeter artillery cannon mounted to it. And so that's what they were hitting the Americans with. And the Americans were just in foxholes. Their artillery was way to the back. So they got hit so quickly, and we're going to see a picture up here.
So we had to pull back. We had to pull back once they hit.
You can go to the next picture. So this is the front line, right. And it's just pretty much a basic front line. The American in black, you can see it's sort of it's across there, but there are gaps in the line. Not very many men. Most of the men were back, actually enjoying themselves. Here's Clairvaux, where we stayed. Bastogne is back in here. And as you can see, the Germans just built this massive front. All of that front is pine forests, and they plant these pine forests, and they look like our cornfields. The pine trees are all in a row, separately spread out. Well, when the Germans hit the pine trees with the artillery, they weren't looking. Well, they were trying to hit the ground, but these shells were going through the pine trees, shattering the tops of these pine trees. Well, the first thing you do when the artillery's coming is dive in your foxhole so you're not getting hit. Well, that didn't help you because they were shattering these trees, sending down shards of pine branches like daggers and killing all the guys in the foxholes. So the best thing to do, they said, is to hug a pine tree. and everything would fall around you, and they had their helmet on. But here it's winter, it's freezing. These guys are in the trenches covered with a parka. They just couldn't handle the onslaught. They got pushed back very quickly, and a lot of them were captured. There were tens of thousands of Americans captured very quickly. But what also happened on the front line, there were units of just small observation, reconnaissance units, different things like that, and they see the Germans coming. They didn't retreat. They just sort of stuck in their foxholes. There's one incident where this reconnaissance unit was in Lazarus, Luxembourg, up on a slope in the pine trees. Town is down below. The Germans are coming in. They said, we got to fight them. There's only 12 guys, but they had their machine guns. They started shooting the Germans as they're coming down the road. The Germans stop. They start sending wave upon wave of these young, newly conscripts. They chopped them down all day long. They survived. Then one of the tank commanders came in with his tanks and said, what's going on? They said, there's a lot of Americans up in the hills. We can't go any further. There's only 12 men. That was happening across the battlefront, too. It held up the Germans a little bit. We can go to the next slide. So this gives you a little bit closer view of how the tanks were coming in and pushing that line out, the bulge, as it goes further and further out, capturing guys along the way, small battles going, the tanks, the infantry. They also found that their big tanks, we had Sherman tanks, which were much smaller than Pershing tanks. Their armament wasn't as thick, but they were more maneuverable than the Germans. The other advantage was they had rubber treads on their tracks. The Germans had metal tracks. The metal tracks on these roads were slipping, and so a lot of these tanks would slip off the road and go into a ravine, or they couldn't maneuver quickly enough, or they were so heavy that they were sinking in these roads, and all they could do is travel on roads. They couldn't travel cross country, and so that slowed them down because there'd be long lines of these switchbacks through the hills, and they couldn't move very quickly, or they'd have to shove a tank off to the side to get by, and what they thought was going to be a rapid advance kept getting slowed down more and more. Plus, they didn't have fuel. They were relying on the American fuel dumps along the way. If they could capture them, they would have fuel.
Something else I remember in the battle in France was the hedgerows. I don't know if you saw the hedgerow.
That was down in Normandy, hedgerows.
And they had to cut through those, and because they get up to them and have a tank go over it. And apparently either an Iowa or an Illinois farm boy figured out how to put like a plow on the front of the tank so we could just bust right through those hedges.
Yeah, they used the Shermans. They used them as bulldozers. Yeah. This area really doesn't have hedgerows like they do down in Normandy. This is like coming out of the Mississippi River Valley up through all on the northeast part of Iowa, coming up onto the flat and the farm fields up above. But even then, it's rolling hills. And they had to stay on the roads. They couldn't go across the fields unless they were frozen. And even a frozen dirt isn't going to support, 68 tons of metal.
So we get pushed back, and then
we're getting pushed back.
Bastogne
gets surrounded. You can go to the next slide.
So how many was that? The 101st Airborne in Bastogne?
Yes. Now. This is just another picture of the tank groups, the different panzer units. Sepp Dietrich was one of the generals. He was up on the northern part, and then Hakeem Piper was in the center. I'll mention both those guys as we go on. They were told, you go, you don't stop. Hitler wouldn't let them retreat. He said, you just have to keep going. You can't stop. And so their orders were just to keep pushing across. And let's see, Sepp Dietrich he was a friend of Hitler's. He wasn't much of a strategist, but he was a very cruel guy. He was a butcher in his civilian life, and he acted like a butcher in his military life too. It was cleaning out everything that was in front of him. You can go to the next slide. So when Hitler took over France, he decided he was going to make an impenetrable wall, but not the forts like the French did. And he created the Siegfried Line. And what it was is a bunch of interconnected, what they call the dragon teeth. And these things underground are all connected, cement, reinforcement rod. This goes on for miles and miles and miles across the whole French countryside. It's probably, maybe 30, 40 yards wide, and it just goes across the countryside. You'll drive down the road, and we found them in the woods. We found them everywhere. And they said tanks can't get over this because it would just tear up any kind of machinery that would go over it, except for the crossings on the bridges where they had it. And so the Americans came up to this, and you talk about the Iowa kid that fixed the Shermans to go over the hedgerows. Well, one young guy says, well, we can't go through it. Why don't we just go over it? So they would have dump trucks dump dirt, and they made roads over it. And all of a sudden, all this work that Hitler put into building this impenetrable line, the Siegfried Line, became somewhat useless to him because we could go across when we'd find an area that wasn't protected. And so anyway, that's what we were faced with as we were cutting across and getting close to the German border. Next slide. We were in one of the battle areas, and there were a lot of foxholes, and they're still finding things all the time. And here we come across this cross. It's two German soldiers. They were digging, and they found the butt of a rifle sticking up, and as they dug, they found these two guys in the trench holding onto each other, both dead, helmets on, the whole bit. So they found this, and this is a memorial. The Germans were as sad as we were as losing their boys across the countryside, and this is just a little memorial that the Germans had. We went to some German cemeteries too, just to see what that was like. But this was just something that stood out to me. We saw many, many things like this. Next slide. This was actually in the battlefield where Band of Brothers was, and that was a real group. The characters in the movie were actually real characters, and these guys had come back to their old foxholes. One of them, and I can't remember his name right offhand, had his leg blown off, and we saw pictures of these guys. He's got his two canes. He's walking across, and this is one of the foxholes, and people go through there, make a little cross, and put it in there. And this was all over, and they were just in the trees. This was a bunch of pines, and these foxholes are on one side of the road, and the Germans were right across on the other side of the road. They were just fighting face to face. Next slide. This is what the pine forests look like. They're all over. And the foxholes are interspersed amongst these pines. And when those shells would hit these pines, chop these things and shatter them and throw these splinters all over, the guys down below were just getting covered with that stuff. And they were also getting hit on the ground with artillery too. But these pines were their protection and their enemy all at the same time. If they chop them down, they could build a roof over themselves. So anyway, this is typically what you see across that whole countryside where there's not farm fields, they're pine forests. Next slide. So then there are Sherman tanks almost in every town as a memorial. And if it's not the Sherman tank itself, it's the top of the Sherman tank. It's and probably because it was blown off when they were hit. These tanks were so vulnerable. Their armor on the side of a Pershing tank, the armor was about 2 to 4 inches thick. So it just depends. So 4 inches thick, you think that's a lot of metal in between for a shell. See, you can also see the rubber tracks on this tank, and so the armament was strong, but the Germans had their guns were so much bigger and so much more powerful. And these are the Dragon. This is what the Dragon teeth look like across the field. So you can see where a Sherman tank coming into that would never be able to get over something like that as they go along. And like I said, there are museums almost every other town with armaments. Our guide said his dad was 12 years old when the war had ended. And as a 12-year-old and his buddies, they'd go out in the battlefield and pick up machine guns, pick up bazookas, pick up whatever. There's landmines all over the place. And they'd shoot these things off, and it was fun. These little kids were having fun in a dangerous battlefield. We actually found a memorial where there were 6 little kids that had blown up on a mine, stepped in a mine, looking around for stuff, and blown up. And this is what was left across the whole countryside, things like this. Next slide. I'm standing. I look a little tired there. We've been hitting the road pretty hard. On the border of the Meuse River, there were a bunch of little bridges going across, and at the German side of every one of these bridges, as you can see behind me, there's a bunker. This is chain-linked fence off a little bit, but you can climb in and look around a little bit. They had these bunkers across with machine gun nests. So if anybody was trying to get across any bridge, they had someone there. If it wasn't the Dragon's Teeth, it was the little bunkers that they had across the whole line to sort of stop anybody from coming across. And so that's one reason why we were holed up on the one side, the western side of those rivers, waiting to get into Germany. This is what the countryside looked like. This is a castle close by to where that one bunker was back up in there. This one wasn't damaged. It wasn't really a battle area, except that I took the picture because it was sort of on the southern end where pretty much the battle had sort of started to peter out. But this is what it looked like, the countryside all across that region. So trying to do fighting in this stuff, it was pretty much men. It couldn't be machines. They just couldn't negotiate that kind of territory. And this was one of the many ancient castles. At one time, these are what they protected themselves with, but with artillery guns, that's just a sitting duck. They could wipe that off the face of the map. Next. Okay, so we go into Luxembourg City, and Luxembourg City was at the south end of the battle. And as a matter of fact, for 20 hours after the Germans had actually attacked, and it was only about 20-some miles away, this was Patton's headquarters. Bradley was coming in and out of there. They didn't even know there was a battle for 20 hours. They had cut all their communications off. So everybody was sitting here in Luxembourg City, and they're saying, what's going on? We don't know what's going on. We can't communicate and everything while we're getting captured and pushed back up north. So this is the chapel that Patton had. This was his headquarters, a big, real neat old building in the middle of Luxembourg City. And this was the chapel that he would pray at every day. And this is the chapel that he prayed for good weather so that the Air Force could start coming in and knocking off the tanks. And the minister who was going to write the prayer. So we don't write prayers for good weather. And he said, damn it, you're going to write a prayer for good weather. And he did, and the weather changed.
When did the weather change? Do you remember?
It was
first of the year or Christmas?
Well, it was about 2 weeks after the beginning. So probably and it was spotty. Then the weather started to clear up. And at that time, then Patton, they said Eisenhower was in Paris and Versailles, and talking with Bradley and saying we've got to push Patton, let Patton head up north with his tanks, because Bastogne was circled now, and if they took Bastogne, that was a major hub for transportation in the whole region, and if the Germans took that, then they would be able to move further east as they were going. And so McAuliffe in Bastogne, he was holding off with his men. He couldn't get out, so they were just being bombarded, and they were fighting back. And so anyway, this was...
Wasn't it in Bastogne, the general who was surrounded for the United States said the Germans kept saying, do you want to surrender? And apparently his answer was nuts.
Yeah, they didn't understand what that was.
Nuts. What's nuts mean? And then next thing you know, they got to Patton. Bradley got to Patton and said, I'm going to relieve that guy. Patton said, I'll relieve this guy. And he had a full battle. They moved the guys 100 miles north in 2 days. Yeah. So Patton kind of went up there and helped out with driving these guys for 2 days, and then put them right into the Battle of the Bulge. Yeah. And then they ended up breaking through because with the clouds lifted, the P-51s could come in, and they just slaughtered their tanks.
Well, it's not only their tanks, it's the railroads bringing the equipment in from the back. The thing is, though, Patton was going up, and even he was having a tough time getting through. And he at one time, and I was just reading this, I just read a book called Battle, and that's about the Battle of the Bulge. And Patton was not even sure he was going to be able to do it. He had some doubts because the Germans were fighting so strongly in that area, and with their armaments and everything.
But they went up there with no sleep, just pulling out of a battle, and got to Bastogne in a couple of days.
They said, how long will it take? And he says, if you let me go now, I'll get there in 2 days. Yeah. And he would usually stay on target. Right. He was a hard charger. Yeah. So you can go to the next slide. So this is Patton's grave. This is at the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. It's another massive cemetery with thousands of men. He said he did not want to be buried. He wanted to be buried with his men. He was killed in a car accident later in the war. It wasn't a battle wound. It was a car accident. And he was buried amongst his men, and then they felt that he should be in front of his men. So they moved his grave, and he's facing thousands of his men that are right below him. And so we walked that cemetery, and they gave us roses to put down on a grave. Each of us had a rose, and I walked way down to the corner, and there's unknowns. And I found an unknown way at the end, and I put it there, and I said, you aren't being remembered. Nobody knows who you are, but somebody's remembering, And it, all through this trip, you were walking amongst ghosts. It was moving to me because I was standing on Normandy Beach. It's sort of the same, but there's so much tourist stuff in a way there. There's lots of people. You go here, and there's nobody. And it's like you're going to a haunted house, and you feel something's there. And that's what it felt like for over a week to me, because we were going through different places and seeing all those graves. This is a little bit of an example of what a house in a village might look like. They just blast that stuff away. And this was right in Chervaux. They maintained this house, this lot, to show what this town looked like after the battle. Everything else is rebuilt, but they left this one house to say, here's what it was like. And it's makes you think the family lived in there. They were probably in the basement when this thing got hit.
It's amazing.
And yeah, it is amazing. Next slide. Another interesting thing, and here again, we did a lot of personal things along the way. It wasn't just going to the main battlefields and everything. One day, our guide said, I want to take you to this little village, and they have a little memorial here, and they're going to do a ceremony, and we want you as a group to put the flowers on this memorial. Well, the memorial is for 8 black men that were an artillery unit. African Americans fighting together in the ranks. They were, you can go to the next, they were retreating. It was cold. They were freezing. They didn't really have much warm equipment and everything. So they went into this little village, and these people in this house took them in. And they said, here, we want to give you hot soup and take care of you. And these guys were just huddled around. And somebody else in the town was a German sympathizer, saw what they did, turned them in. They took the 8 guys, took them out to the spot where that memorial was, tortured them, and killed them. They found them there, laying there. The townspeople took them back, took care of the bodies. And this is the house that they were in. And to this day, the people in this region, Belgium and Luxembourg, love Americans. It's not just they like Americans because Americans are Americans. They love the Americans because they saved them. And everywhere you go, they just pat you on the back or say, thank you so very much. It's there again, that's a moving thing. So this house still has a little shrine for these guys. And they took us right into the house where these guys were. All these houses are still there, you know. Next slide. This is the table they ate at. They still have the table there. They have their pictures on the wall of these 8 black guys. They just revere our soldiers, and they take care of everything that our soldiers touched and the people's lives that they saved. And so anyway, you go here again, and you can feel those 8 guys sitting around the table. You know, I wish they would have had a bowl of soup there, you know, but it's, okay. So then there's a museum that has a lot of equipment, and this is what one of their King Tiger tanks looks like. Okay, this King Tiger tank, it's 68 tons, 88 millimeter cannon, will go 41 miles an hour for 120 miles. This thing is a cruiser, and it's a beast. And the armament on this slopes so that if shells hit it, they slide and bounce off. They don't go in, okay? Like if you have a flat side of a tank.
A lot larger than a Sherman, right?
Oh, yeah. A Sherman tank's only 46 tons. 33 tons, a Sherman. A Pershing is 46 tons. Amazing. So this thing is another third larger. Beautiful. Bigger guns. So these are my 2 buddies and I standing in front of this tank. Five crew members in a tank like that, and they have periscopes to see out, so you don't have to look out little holes, so you can't shoot in a hole. Next picture. This shows what our shells would do to a Tiger tank. They'd hit it. If they hit it right on the tip, it would stick, or they bounce off. The armament was so thick on these things that it was just. But as you can see, metal treads. They could, and they were so heavy, so they slide around. Yep. This is one of our Sherman tanks. That's what their shells did to our Sherman tanks. We saw numerous American tanks. That thing, the poor men inside this sucker, they just fried. You know, that thing went right through. There was an exit hole on the other side, and it just shows what happened to our tanks. But ours were, like I said, a little more maneuverable. They could hide in smaller spaces. You can see in this hole here the sort of the burning shell that was surrounding it here. It just shows the devastation. And like I said, we saw many of these things. The turrets would blow off and everything. We lost, I think, I'm trying to remember which battle it was where it was Chervaux, where we were staying. The Germans lost 4 tanks. We lost 40 tanks. That just shows how uneven our armaments were.
Do you have any more slides? Because we're going to need to wrap up here.
Well,
I think that's the end of it, guys. We got through it all.
That's all.
Okay.
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 So, what do you have for a couple things? Do you have any statistics on how many people were lost during World War II?
Yes, I do.
I think that's interesting. And then also, this trip just looks amazing. If you like history, if you like World War I and II, how did you get that trip set up?
Okay.
So maybe start with the losses.
Okay. So
And then,
World War II, Germans had 18 million soldiers. They lost 11 million out of the 18.
amazing.
And there was 6 million killed, 5 million wounded seriously. Americans 2 million. We lost about 300,000 and wounded about 600,000. So we lost about 1 million. We lost about half the men. That killed and wounded. That's what I consider lost.
What about the Russians?
I didn't get stats on any of the Russian stuff on the front, but that was even more severe.
Yeah, I think it was twice as much as the Germans.
Yeah.
It's awful.
In World War I, total, killed in World War I, there were 70 to 85. No, World War II. I'm sorry, 70 to 85 million people died in World War II for across the board
thing.
with
Civilians,
everything,
military, which
Yeah.
I don't think that number's staggering. I think that's why one of the main reasons we don't want to ever have a war. They're awful. It's just a terrible thing.
Every time you have a war, the armaments get more devastating.
Right.
And this next time,
Nuclear.
well, what's
whatever.
happening in the Ukraine right now is very telling because it's sort of going to be a test ground of what the new weaponry is, except for nuclear weapons. If that happens, then we're all gone.
Right. So tell us about how you got into this tour and travel,
we went down to the World War II Museum in New Orleans. Okay, phenomenal museum. We through the foundation, we had some connections with the leadership, including Tom Brokaw, who wrote The Greatest Generation.
Great book.
And so we went down there toured the museum, which is phenomenal. It's World War II and the Pacific and the European conflict in World War II. So they cover everything. It started with Normandy, and because of the Higgins boats that they were made in
New Orleans,
right. And then it grew from there. So they had a tour for the Battle of the Bulge. We signed up for the tour. The main tour was full already, so we said we'd like to go. So they put a second tour together, and our group was smaller, but they didn't care, and they had the guy from Band of Brothers with us. The tour guide actually has his own tour company, and it's in Wiltz, and his name is Roland Gaul, Gaul. His father was the 12-year-old on the battlefield. So they have their own museum, which shows every bit of equipment, German and American, radios, guns, equipment, mines, everything in this museum in Wiltz. And he was our guide, and he's so well versed on this stuff. He's like an encyclopedia. He can name the generals and the units and the battalions. He knows the numbers.
How much time would you allocate for this trip? 2 weeks, week?
Well, this trip was a week.
A week.
Yeah.
So you need to get over. Do you fly into Paris or?
You fly into Brussels.
Brussels. Okay.
They pick you up. They take you into Luxembourg, and it's a very detailed private tour. So
Right.
I mean, you see everything, and you go behind the scenes, that kind of thing.
So if you want a little World War II history or World War I, this is the guy to talk to, huh?
Well, he's World War II, and he's
Two.
mostly Battle of the Bulge. He also
Okay.
does a Vietnam one because the French were in Vietnam also. So he was going to do a Vietnam one. But go through the World War II Museum in New Orleans,
Great.
and they have a whole series of Normandy, the whole bit. So,
Well, Bill, this has been fantastic.
I could
Thanks for
talk
coming
for
in. I know.
hours on this.
We could keep going because I
Yeah.
like this history too, but that's about the amount of time we have for today. But this has been wonderful. Appreciate your time and thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thanks for telling us.
You're
about this.
welcome.